Test this out. Okay. I think this is where we ended last time. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay, let me make sure that it's picking up sound. Okay. Guess that's picking up sound. Right. Okay, so I presume this is where we ended for this class. That's my other class. I was like, why are we in chapter 15? All right. So after Lincoln got shot, it was up to Andrew Johnson to to take over the Reconstruction. And that didn't go so well. He was more interested in punishing the aristocratic elite in the South than actually like helping the newly freed slaves. So he more or less let the South take care of itself, which would cause further issues, as we're going to see in just a little bit. Many Confederate officials actually began winning elections. Georgia elected the Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens, for example, into the Senate. South Carolina and Mississippi refused to repudiate the war debt, and Mississippi also wouldn't ratify the 13th Amendment because, of course, they wouldn't. It's Mississippi. And then they also issued black codes in southern states that restricted basic rights to the black population, which, as we saw, do I have? Yeah. Was used to use that lovely loophole in the 13th Amendment that if you're a convict, the anti-slavery law no longer applies to you. So if we pass laws that are strictly anti-black and then we fill the jails with African Americans, then we basically have slavery again. So yeah, any questions before we move on to new material? Okay, cool. Right, let's move on. We've had this at the end. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So, Republicans in Congress weren't very happy with how lenient Johnson was being. So the lawmakers trying to return to Congress were actually barred from entry because, well, they had just recently had a civil war. And many of them were actually Confederate officials. Johnson announced this as illegitimate, and this was the final breaking point. So, January of 1866. This was that image that I showed at the beginning of the previous slide at the end of last class, but this is also on this slide, so I'm just going to show it again. Johnson refused to sign a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau by 2 years, vetoed the Civil Rights Act because of course he did. The Civil Rights Act was used to protect the free people from the restrictions of the black codes. Some moderates and radicals both agreed that they needed to work against Johnson. He also argued that the Freedmen's Bureau infringed on the rights of the states to handle their own economic affairs, because apparently protecting the rights of a group of people that had just been freed from slavery was infringing upon the economic freedoms of the state or whatever. So Congress repassed the Freedmen's Bureau extension and the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto. You don't see that too terribly often because in order to pass anything over a veto, you have to have like a supermajority in Congress, which is 2/3, I believe. all agreeing over the president. They adopted the 14th Amendment, covered the provisions of the Civil Rights Act, and overturned the Dred Scott case, which said that blacks were not citizens because, of course, as I mentioned last week, while they were no longer enslaved, they didn't really have any rights. So there was this period of limbo where, yeah, they weren't enslaved, but they also had no legal protections whatsoever. So it was a really bad period. Things in the South were getting very, very bad. There was this massive anti-black riot in Memphis the month before. Let me see if the book actually specifically mentions it. Do, 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 do. 46 African Americans and 2 whites have been killed. Skirmish between white policemen and black Union veterans on May 1st, 1866. 3 days rioting by white mobs that attacked the black communities. Yeah. Johnson encouraged the southern states to reject the 14th Amendment because he was just being pedantic and fighting against anything that Congress wanted to do at this point. Though, interestingly enough, Tennessee, which was his home state, was the first and only to initially accept the 14th Amendment. So here's that image I had again of this big-headed caricature of Andrew Johnson kicking the Freedmen's Bureau down the stairs with the veto, which, as we saw, that awful racist cartoon, some people thought that was a great idea that the president vetoed it because it was helping black Americans at all. I don't know. So, with the president being backed into a corner with the veto being overturned, Congress began passing legislation in the 40th Congress, and they believed that unless African Americans had access to the vote, they would very likely be unable to maintain their freedom. So, Congress passed 3 military reconstruction acts. The 10 southern states, minus Tennessee, because Tennessee was actually behaving, having passed the 14th Amendment, so they were exempt from all this. The 10 southern states were split into 5 military districts under the supervision of a Union general and his troops. All the voters in the state, which is to say the white male voters in the state, would elect delegates into a constitutional convention, accepting Confederate officials because, well, they had fought against the Union, so they probably shouldn't be allowed to be part of this. They would then draft new constitutions that would guarantee black suffrage and ratify the 14th Amendment. So within a year, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas had towed the line and been readmitted into the Union. Now, there were several states, I've got a map here in just a moment, that shows a few that held out until about 1870. Mississippi was, of course, one of them. But then, as we're going to see, it doesn't take too terribly long for more pro-white, anti-black power to take control again. So this entire time, Johnson had been trying to undermine the plan because, of course, he had been. Because the president was still the commander-in-chief. He was he had been basically telling the generals to not be as strict in the South as they were supposed to be. And, well, technically they had to listen to him. So Congress passed the Command of the Army Act. Johnson had to go through the General of the Army in Washington in order to command the troops. And the General of the Army in Washington was Ulysses S. Grant. And if you know anything about the Civil War, Grant was the general on the side of the Union, so he wasn't going to exactly be especially generous to the South. He also won the election in 1868, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So this last point seems very, very minor, almost more like a footnote than anything else. However, it's a pretty big deal in the fact that it silences Johnson for the remainder of his term. Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, which made it so Johnson could not remove cabinet members without Senate approval. He did so anyway, therefore directly violating this act that had been passed, and was thus impeached by the House but not by the Senate. In other words, his presidency was on thin ice. And at least used to be back in the day, when you're impeached by the House, even if you don't get completely kicked out of office, that usually puts you in the corner and reminds you that you are about to lose your job, you should probably behave. So he no longer put his nose where it didn't belong. So following this, Johnson was no longer an issue. Now that said, it's not like Reconstruction went ahead flawlessly after Johnson stopped being a pain in the ass, but Johnson was no longer a pain in the ass after the Tenure of Office Act. Well, after he broke the Tenure of Office Act. So here's the various military districts. Again, this is in your book, but the book doesn't color code it for us. It just has very heavy lines between the various districts. Everything else is almost identical. Does it actually give us the generals? It does not. My map's better. My map actually tells us who the generals are in each of the districts, so that's cool. So yeah, Virginia is its own district. North and South Carolina are a district. Georgia, Alabama, and Florida are a district. I guess because Florida wasn't heavily populated at this point. You didn't really have anything but swamp in Florida. The only reason we have anything in Florida now is because Walt Disney was like, hey, there's nothing but swamp here. Nobody's going to expect me to buy up a bunch of land and put a freaking theme park here. And now everything's down there. Arkansas, Mississippi are one, and then Texas and Louisiana. So, again, Texas wasn't especially heavily populated yet, even though it's a lot of land. And Virginia is its own because Virginia was probably the most heavily populated state out of all of these, if you're curious. So yeah, so we have the date of readmission of this into the Union. 1868 were the ones that were behaving. And then 1870, Texas, Mississippi, of course, Georgia. and Virginia, despite being closest to the Union. And then that second date is also in the book. The date that conservative rule was reestablished, when we had the Redeemers come back into power, which we'll get into in a little bit. But yeah, this is very similar to the one in the book. It's just this one's more colorful. All right. There's Ulysses S. Grant. If you don't know what he looks like, not that this isn't an art history test. I'm not going to put up pictures and ask you to identify people. I would say this is him not drunk, but I don't know. His cheeks are a little bit flushed. He might be drunk. Grant was normally drunk. Okay. Now, just because the amendment was passed doesn't mean it has been ratified. That's the thing about the amendments, is just because they're passed into law doesn't mean they've been ratified and therefore made an amendment yet. So, passed in 1869, protected black suffrage, which was initially part of the Military Reconstruction Acts, but the Military Reconstruction Acts were temporary, so this needed to be put on the books. Prohibited discrimination based on race. It allowed for voting to be denied based on literacy, payment of taxes, moral character, whatever that means, and many other things that would be used to deny the vote for many years to come. Like things that are still happening today, like having to have certain kinds of ID that certain groups often don't have. But, you know. The Un-American Anti-Slavery Society disbanded slavery because it's like, hey, slavery's over. We don't need to be a thing anymore. And they're like, oh, wait, things are still awful. Let's get back together and just rebrand ourselves. And became the American Equal Rights Association to fight for the rights of the free people. It's like, yay, slavery's over. Oh, wait. Things are still bad. There are also concerns about the 14th Amendment. This, again, is back making African American citizens. It inserted the word male into the Constitution for the first time. This was repeated with the 15th Amendment, as it excluded women from the vote. Now, the push for female suffrage had been a long time coming. I mean, since even before the Revolution, for those of you that were in my class last semester, which I'd say is most of you. Or at least last year, because a lot of you have come back. Some people wanted the woman vote before the black vote. Others believed that if we pushed the vote for the freedmen, that the vote for women would come soon after. Soon would be doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because it wouldn't be until like after World War I before women got the right to vote. I think New Zealand was the first country to give women the right to vote, and that was in like the late 1800s. So we have two groups with very different names, so it's easy to tell them apart. The National Women's Suffrage Association, which was headed by Stanton and Anthony. That's their last names. Do I have their full name here? No, the book goes into greater detail, but I didn't read the whole thing. I mean, not recently. Here we are. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Yeah, okay. Yes. So they opposed the 15th Amendment, while the American Women's Suffrage Association, which you can tell is different because it says American rather than national, great naming, y'all. This group attracted men and women, white and black, supported the amendment. And in 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, but it still excluded women. The suffrage movement is, personally, to me, more interesting to talk about in my 104 course, because when we talk about it in Britain, they get violent, and it's fun. People are terrified of the suffragettes. But women were being arrested in the United States for demonstrating about the right to vote. So here we have the American Women's Suffrage Association. Very loud, thank you for that. The Church of the Redeemer, et cetera, et cetera. So this being the American Women's Suffrage Association, they brought in men and women. So you have, Mrs. Lucy Stone of Boston. Everyone knows Mrs. Lucy Stone. Mrs. Julia Ward. But you also have Henry Blackwell, who I assume is not a woman. Major J.A. Pickler. Reverend J.H. Tuttle. So you had men and women speaking here. And we have suffrage, songs, and music. Yay. Admission is free, all are invited. So this was a bigger tent, to use the political term. It attracted more people because it included more people. Unfortunately, it didn't quite get the vote for women. So back to Reconstruction. So Johnson was put in the corner, and they got back to Reconstruction proper. Now, of course, the Southern gentry were terrified. Oh no, the slaves are freed, and now they're going to do us a murder. But that never happened because the whites still maintained the majority of the political and economic power. Only one rebel was actually executed for war crimes. I might have mentioned this last time because I couldn't remember his name. He was the commandant of Andersonville Prison in Georgia. It doesn't ever actually say his name, does it? Nope, doesn't say his name. And only one official actually went to prison, which is to say Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. And he didn't go to prison for terribly long, if I remember. No official was forced into exile. Some did flee voluntarily. A fair number went to Brazil, if I remember right. Brazil or Argentina? No, Argentina was the Nazis. Brazil. There's a region in Brazil that's weirdly southern. Like there's this place in Brazil, and it feels like you're in the American South. It's weird. Yes. Yeah, we talked about that the last time you were in my class. Yes. It's like we talked about this recently, but yes, they have like Confederate flags and barbecues, and it's very weird. Yeah, it's very, Latin America and South America they like to absorb other cultures, and it's just like, it's okay. It's like, yeah, whatever, do what you want. We're just going to absorb it. It's a weird little time capsule, yeah. It was this idea of like, we're gonna flee to Brazil and then rebuild our forces and come back, and they just stayed in Brazil. So, at the start of the Reconstruction, there were two groups of whites that held the majority of political power. First, the Republicans in the South that opposed secession to begin with. Like I said last class, it wasn't like everybody in the South was all about the Civil War. There were plenty in the South that opposed it, such as the political left, the Republicans. Now they were typically small merchants and mountain dwellers, the ones that weren't involved in slavery at all or like part of the slave economy. They were called scalawags, which is another term for scoundrels or simply traitors, by the Democrats who held the majority of the power in the South. The other group was the Northerners who moved south to aid in Reconstruction, and they saw it as a new frontier because the South was like several decades behind the North in terms of industrial innovation. I mean, some of that was on purpose, but a lot of it was very detrimental to, well, everything. A lot of it was felt during the war when the North was just like sending in troops by train and sending in supplies by train and sending in cannons by train. And the South is like, oh, this sucks. We screwed up. So they were seen as coming to plunder the resource-rich South before trading to the North. They were called carpetbaggers, even though they were typically coming to the South to like help them come into the current century. But, you know, if you were raised here in the South and you went to a typical school, you were probably taught that the scalawags and carpetbaggers are actually just bad guys. At least that's how I was taught. They had no redeeming qualities. Now, while blacks, of course, had very little political power, they were very enthusiastic to exercise their right to vote and hold office with what little power they did have. Often they would work with sympathetic whites to shape the politics of the time. But as far as their economic position, they were still stuck in like a sharecropping agreement, which sharecropping is, if you're not familiar with it, you're not going to get anywhere with sharecropping. Sharecropping is like, hey, you can borrow part of my field and grow stuff on it, but you have to give me like 80% of it as payment, and then you can keep the other 20%. And that 20% is probably not enough for you to actually sell and make money. It's enough for you to maybe survive. So you're not gonna make any money sharecropping. Another group known as the Exodusters, which is one of the coolest names in this section of the book, so I'm definitely gonna use it. These black communities cropped up in the Midwest as they left the South and began moving westward. Because, yeah, we're going to use the Exodus terminology as we head west, but also the Midwest is full of dust, so we're going to add that in, and it's going to make a really cool portmanteau. So anyway, we have this cartoon of the carpetbaggers use the Southern defeat for personal gain. Oh no, the South was defeated. How were they defeated? Oh, they were defeated in the war. What was the war about? We don't talk about that. The South was a victim of this war that they had nothing to do with. And then I have this slide that I just stole offline. Scalawag, someone who supported the cause for his own gain. White Southern Republicans went on the enemies of Scalawags. Carpetbaggers moved to the southern states for reconstruction for their own benefit. Called carpetbaggers because they packed their belongings in suitcases made out of this awful carpet-like material. It's a bag made out of this like really gross carpet material. It's not cool. Also, although the character there in the back is covered up a little bit by these images, for some reason the carpetbagger has got some like stereotypically Jewish features, because of course we're going to throw in some anti-Semitism. I mean, we are about to get to the KKK, so, you know, let's throw that in there while we're at it. And we have the Exodusters hanging out on the road, taking a break. The kid's wore out. He's just sleeping on a sack. So, needless to say, not everybody was happy with the idea of Reconstruction. White Southerners resented the interracial government during the Reconstruction. They accused it of corruption because, of course, in 1870, Virginia, and as late as 1877, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, Republican governments were voted out in favor of Democrats who claimed to be the redemption of the South. Now, we had the Redeemers last semester, or for those of you that were here last fall. This is a different group of Redeemers. They won through the vote, but violence, intimidation, and voter fraud made that possible. And if you're familiar at all with the Redeemers of this era, you should know about this group. This group that used threats of and actual violence was founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, by General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He got a hold of some Confederate veterans and formed a small group that surely nobody knows about anymore, known as the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Hoo boy. They used physical force to frighten free people away from the ballot boxes, and when the fear of violence didn't work, they just murdered people. Killed 150 African Americans in 1871 in Jackson County in Florida, and hundreds of Republicans in the 1875 election in Mississippi. Because, you know, when you murder a bunch of people, they can't vote. Government did eventually step in. They used a number of force acts to dispatch officials to prevent voting fraud. Congress established a joint committee to probe Klan activities. This produced 13 volumes of vivid testimony of Klan activities and the atrocities they committed. And the book goes into a little bit of detail about said atrocities. And, I mean, one can imagine the atrocities they got up to. All sorts of lynching and torture and, of course, the murders. So, yeah, you know, because, hey, just because slavery's over doesn't mean we're going to treat these people like people. Once again, Harper's Weekly, and Thomas Nast, who we've actually seen a bit of. This is a white man's government. We have, I think that's Horace Greeley there to the left. No, that's not Horace Greeley. I know I've seen that guy around, that weird goblin-looking guy to the left. And you've got CSA, this Confederate veteran there in the back, which is to say a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and a number of the guy to the right and left are politicians taking advantage of that. And here we have some early uniforms of the Ku Klux Klan. And this image is actually in the book. Simply called Visit of the Ku Klux Klan, a wood engraving at the height of Ku Klux Klan violence, depicts a black family seemingly secure in their home in the evening while masked Klansmen stand in the doorway ready to attack with rifles. Here we go. There's Horace Greeley. So, we're going to see this in the next couple of slides. So Horace Greeley, the big fellow there, was running against Grant, and Grant, one of his campaign slogans was, "Let us clasp hands over the bloody chasm," which is to say, the Civil War has created this bloody chasm between the North and South, and we need to remedy that. And Horace Greeley, his opponent in this second election, was very happy to use these redeemers for his benefit, especially in the South. A great victory has been won in Georgia. The verdict in Georgia is certainly conclusive, says the New York Tribune. He was an editor of the New York Tribune, so, and you're seeing there in the background the very peaceful voting going on there. Anything to beat Grant, what are you going to do about it? This, of course, is once again Harper's Weekly. Baltimore, once again, let us clasp hands over the bloody chasm. Once again, Harper's Weekly. I don't think I ever actually have a question about Harper's Weekly because it's not in the notes, but those are where most of my images come from. So while these Northerners had been pushing for civil rights, most of them still agree with their Southern counterparts that blacks were inferior to whites and not fit to govern themselves, because sure, they want these people that had just been freed from slavery to have some amount of civil rights, but they're still racist. Liberal Republicans challenged Grant for re-election in 1872. This is where Horace Greeley shows up. Teamed up with the Democratic Party to oust Grant by exposing the financial corruption in the government. And there was financial corruption in the government. That's not untrue. However, Horace Greeley was willingly working with, the Redeemers, the KKK, to win votes. Grant used the bloody flag, which is to say a vote against Grant tarnished the memory of those killed in the war, and also they recently created Arlington Cemetery. So we had like a national cemetery for servicemen killed in the war. Or killed in a war, any war. So Grant had a lot of power behind him. Grant won his second term, but Republican power was waning in the South. 1872, Congress removed most of the remaining penalties on former Confederate officers. Democrats granted majority in the South for the first time since the war in 74. Began removing troops. And then, of course, and we're going to see this a lot in this class, so be ready for And then a financial panic happened. It seems like it happens every 8 years. Financial panic followed the collapse of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Bleh. We're also going to see a lot of that. It's like a railroad collapsed and then panic. Or panic, then a railroad collapsed. It's just, there's a lot of that. So the average everyday person was more concerned with the economy than racial concerns, because it's like, hey, I need to be able to buy food. I don't care so much about what happens to people who are actually worse off than me, because I'm more worried about me. And also the collapse, especially with the railroads, caused strikes, which had the business owners petitioning the government to bring troops back up from the South to break the strikes, because, the unions had no power, rather than use these troops in the South to, keep the free people safe. And then the 14th Amendment was narrowed to the point that the Civil Rights Act was struck down in 1875. Let me read this out, because I got to it a little bit late when I was teaching on Thursday. Okay. Let's see. Reflecting the shift from moral to economic concerns. This is where this thing started. Interpret the amendment as extending greater protection to corporations and conducting business than extended to blacks, because corporations are people now, I guess. Blacks had to depend on southern state governments to protect their civil rights, the same state authorities that had deprived them of their rights in the first place. The High Court then narrowed the 14th Amendment further, ruling that it protected blacks against abuses only by state officials and agencies, not by private groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. 7 years later, this is 1875, the court struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had extended full and equal treatment in public accommodations for persons of all races. So it basically meant that discrimination was illegal now. So the South was an apartheid region again. Back to Harper's Weekly. This is a New York Tribune what's the word? Tribute? Not really a tribute. They're making fun of it. Meme images weren't a thing invented during the time of the internet. What I know about X was a thing that existed in the time of the newspapers, at least around this time. It was something that, at least I know, was in the New York Tribune, especially something that Horace Greeley often wrote. So Harper's Weekly wrote a What I Know About Horace Greeley. You've got him here, the traitor, taking information from Jefferson Davis, and then here, the Patriot, you've got Grant at the White House, and he's going to sling mud at Grant, mudslinging. But even more interestingly, if you look in greater detail, where's my mouse? He's dripping it on himself. So he's making himself look bad by trying to make Grant look bad. It's a nice little bit of detail there. Because you see here, he's got a New York Tribune thing. He goes, what I know about steering. But anyway, this whole image is, now that the good ship Union has been safely steered through the sea of trouble, is it into peaceful waters, shall the helmsman be thrown overboard? You've got a bunch of weirdos standing around Grant. I don't know who the dude is with the long legs. Again, all these people are like well-known political figures or political commentators of the day. So it's not something that I would get. It'd be like having, who's the political commentator with the tiny face? Charlie Kirk? I don't know, the guy with the tiny face. It'd be like having him on a thing and somebody like 100 years in the future not knowing who the hell he is. And then again, there's Horace Greeley literally making a deal with the devil. Satan, don't get thee behind me anything to get possession. Okay. So Grant won the thing, obviously. But it's the election of 1876 that's very important. So the election of 1876 was what brought the Reconstruction to an end. Rutherford B. Hayes was selected, nominated, whatever, words, by the Republicans. He was a Civil War officer. He was seen as free of the corruption of Grant's administration because, again, yes, Grant was a hero in the Civil War, but he did have a pretty rough administration. So, you know, let's get somebody that's not part of that administration. Cool. The Democrats nominated Samuel J. Tilden, who fought corruption in New York. Okay, well, obviously Tilden isn't like a Confederate official. He's from New York, and he literally fought corruption in New York. So that's not a bad choice either. The outcome was horrifyingly close. It ended up depending on 20 disputed votes. Tilden won 51% of the popular vote. However, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina had this really weird system. I don't know why it even went this way. As you may know, or as you will likely know when it's time for y'all to vote, the presidential election isn't just for the president. Usually a fair number of senators and Congress and House representatives and whatnot are also up for re-election. So a lot of times the House and Senate will also have a change up. So what ended up happening is a number of Democrats or a number of Republicans in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina were voted out, and Democrats were voted in. So the outgoing Republicans certified Hayes, the incoming Democrats certified Tilden, which, like, if you're being voted out, why do you get a vote? You no longer have a job. I don't know. That seems weird. So there was a split in the Senate and House of Representatives because they were, of course, also very close. Congress created a 15-member joint electoral committee, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. The independent saw the writing on the wall, said, I'm not doing this, and left. His replacement voted with the Republicans and confirmed Hayes. Still, though, Congress had to ratify the decision because the little council they made up did the thing, they still have to ratify it. However, Southern Democrats were pissed and threatened to filibuster to hold the decision until inauguration, which I guess would have been like a pain in the butt. I don't know. So in the Compromise of 1877, Hayes was allowed into the White House. However, he had to promise to elect a Southerner to his cabinet, to withdraw federal troops from the South, and to build a transcontinental railroad, I can never say that word properly, through the South. So, though technically the Republican candidate won, which is to say the Northern Liberal candidate won, it was with such a compromise that the Southern Democrats got what they wanted, which is to say the end of the Reconstruction, the end of federal protection for the free people in the South. So here we have the map. So again, it's Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. They had outgoing Republicans and incoming Democrats, and I don't know why they counted the ones that were going out. I don't know. But the book doesn't go into how bad this compromise was, because we almost had a war over it. Like, I know we literally had a war at this point 10 years ago, but the KKK was up in arms, and, you know, they're ready to kill anybody. I mean, there was about to be blood over this. So this compromise wasn't just, oh, well, it would be really annoying if they filibustered until inauguration. It was almost very bad. Then we do have the compromise with the South, memory of the Union heroes who died in a useless war, dedicated to the Chicago Convention. So yeah, the election of 1876 was, again, on paper, it seems like not a huge thing. It's like, oh, well, it was really close, and one side won and the other side got a couple of things, but like the couple of things the other side got ended Reconstruction and almost returned things to how they had been. Like, if you look at it at the end of the day, Reconstruction was pretty limited. The free people were not given land ownership, which would have allowed them some level of economic independence, which has rippled down to the modern day. And while there were some economic strides from the federal government, some movement from the federal government, the Redeemers took over and reversed things. And the Republican Party began shifting focus because of the economic concerns. The Democratic Party began taking things back over. And of course, you know, the North was still just as racist as the South. So it's not like things were necessarily done in terms of altruism. But it was just like, well, we've got all these people who are now no longer enslaved. We need to at least make them citizens and give them some amount of rights. And it's like, okay, well, that's done. Let's just drop it. Still, though, the end of slavery and freedom was enshrined in the Constitution, and blacks were given some measure of political and economic power. And this war, emancipation, and Reconstruction did help change the country as a whole and move towards this more perfect union, as Lincoln put it. Now, we do still have about 10 minutes, and the other class is ahead of us. So I'd like to push ahead a little bit into the next chapter. And I'll put this up on Blackboard when I think about it. So let's get to chapter 15 just a little bit. Now, again, we are moving back a little bit to right at the end of the war, so we are going to cover a little bit of the same time period, but we're not really going to cover any of the same geographic locations, so there shouldn't be any overlap. So, as I mentioned in, excuse me, the intro last week, one of the things that happened immediately after the war is people started looking west for expansion. Because, again, as we talked about in the previous class, the Louisiana Purchase did allow for territory west of the Mississippi, but that hadn't really been settled very much before the war happened. We had some settlement in California, although a lot of that was already settled. We'll get to that later. But the Great Plains themselves, west of the Mississippi, semi-arid, lots of grass, not many trees. If you've ever been west of the Mississippi, it's not great. My family decided to take a road trip to Yellowstone, and once we got west of the Mississippi, I thought I was going to die. It was just nothing but grass and hills and more grass. It was just so monotonous, I thought I was going to go insane. The natives had learned how to cultivate the land and its many animals, but for the farmers, the small American farmers, it wasn't what they were used to dealing with. They would have, acres of land here in the east. They'd cut down a bunch of trees, and wood was often plentiful. But out west, they would just get lots and lots of acres of land and roam livestock. So when we think about the West, the Old West, we think about individualism and independence, but typically it was done through the government. Federal land grants, mining, lumber, and railroad companies were usually what pushed people west. It wasn't just, a little family in their covered wagon heading west out on their own, hoping for the best. It was typically people that were being granted this land by the government or by these companies to cultivate that land in order to make money back. And it should be said that the capital for these companies, the mining companies, the lumber companies, and especially the railroads, I can't talk, usually came from overseas, particularly Europe and especially Britain. They were very interested in having a hand in shaping the frontier, because if you put money into an undeveloped region and makes lots of money, you're going to make money back. And Britain was all about that. I mean, Britain did that all over the world. It only really worked in India. And once again, railroads was the way to do things. I mean, there's literally there's like a little pie graph on page 462, and it's like 49% of Britain's investment was just railroads. I mentioned in my class on Thursday that in my American technology class, Whereas like the first 3 chapters, if you didn't know an answer, it was probably wood. Chapters like 4 through 6, if you didn't know the answer, it was probably railroads. And for this chapter, that's kind of the case. The answer is probably going to be railroad. Railroads were extremely important, not just for moving stuff, but because of all of the industries that fed into them. Your steel, coal, iron, glass, what else? Brass for lots of the pieces. All very important. And then, of course, you have the Transcontinental Railroad. We're almost done. Settle down. Central Pacific Company built from the west, and from Sacramento, California, employing the Chinese workers. From Council Bluffs, Iowa, was the Union Pacific Company that hired Irish. They joined Promontory Point, Utah. If you've ever seen Wild Wild West from like 1998, they actually showed that event with Grant hammering in the golden spike, which they immediately replaced because gold does not make a good railroad spike. And then the book mentions that there was like so much money going into this that it bred corruption, and they took care of that. But yeah, so here's how things looked in 1850. You had your states and then lots of unorganized territory. Once you get to a certain point, the geography changes because, yeah, it's like flat plains and then the Rockies. It's not like the Appalachians. And then also this awful image, I'm sorry for burning your eyes. It's because of the railroads that we have time zones. The railroads invented time zones. Because each city had like its own time. New York and Boston were like 15 minutes apart or something. And then when the railroads became more efficient, they're like, nah, this doesn't work. We're going to make our own time zones. And I think by World War I, the national government was like, okay, we're going to refine this a little bit because you cutting through states doesn't quite work for us. But we're going to refine that and make it official. But yeah, it was because of railroads. And there's the Transcontinental Railroad. And there they are again. Got a lot of cool images from this time period. Okay, we'll talk about genocide next time. See y'all on Wednesday. Okie dokie. Yeah, I'll see y'all next week. No, not next week. On Wednesday. What am I saying? See y'all on Wednesday. Bye.